Okay. Boo. Nice. Okay, cool. So, lovely to see you all. I do hope you're doing well. Um, so, the plan for today is going to be basically let's talk now about evaluating TFL sentences, right? So, what we've done up until this point is we've gotten our grammar right. So, we spent a lot of time last week in the lecture and last week in the tutorials going through and making sure that we know how to construct TFL sentences. What we're going to do now is talk about when are they true and when are they false. So that's going to be the aim. More specifically, I want to start off by talking to you about the general idea of truth functionality. So this is actually why our language is called TFL, right? It's truth functional logic. So I want to talk to you about what that is, what this notion is, why it's so important, and why our language is structured around this concept. Then I want to turn, and this is going to be the bulk of the day, we're going to talk about truth tables. So truth tables are going to actually be the machinery that we use to evaluate when TFL sentences are true and false. Right? So just a show of hands, have some people done truth tables before in other places? Okay, yeah, kind of what I figured. Right. So we'll introduce what we'll call the characteristic truth tables. So these are the basic functions attached to each connective. And then we'll talk about complete tables. Complete tables are once we start sticking all of these things together to get full sentences. Once we have the machinery in place, we'll talk about what it lets us do. So we'll introduce some notions, we'll call them semantic concepts. These are effectively technical versions of some of those key ideas we ran into in lecture 1. They're all going to be defined in terms of the truth table machinery, but it's ways to capture things like necessary truths, logical equivalence, joint consistency, all of these kinds of things. And of course, the big payoff, we're going to have a tool to test for validity. So we'll have a lovely piece of machinery that will settle the question of whether an argument's valid or invalid, at least in virtue of form. And then if there's time, we'll talk a little bit about using some shortcuts and partial tables. Because again, between friends, I'm really lazy. So I'm always looking for a way to save myself a little bit of time and effort. And I'm going to try and teach you how to do that too. So this is the plan. Before we dive into the actual content, the usual question about how we want to run the session. Do people want to go for about 45 and take a break, or just hammer through and end a little early? Break? Okay. So we'll go for about 45 to about 1:30, and then we'll take a pause. I'd like to try and get at least through the characteristic truth tables, so we might go a little bit longer, but we'll definitely try and take a break. Right. And the usual, if you have to go. Try not to make a huge amount of noise, but we'll figure it out. Cool. Okay. So, truth functionality, the big idea. So, last week, we talked about the construction methods for complex TFL sentences. Remember, the 7-clause definition of a TFL sentence. And we know that any non-atomic sentence of TFL is going to be composed of atoms linked up with the connectives. Now, we can say that a connective is truth functional if and only if the truth value of a sentence featuring that connective as its main operator is determined by the truth values of the constituent sentences. So that's a long, kind of slightly awkward definition, but the basic idea is hopefully clear. A connective is truth functional if its truth value is determined by the truth values of the parts below it. Basically, you can think about this in terms of on and off. A connective is going to be truth functional if whether it's on or off is determined by whether the parts are on or off. So we flip the atomic sentences to on or off, and then that will filter up and tell us whether the main connective is on or off, true or false. Every connective in TFL, the 5 that we have, are truth functional. That is, to determine the truth value of a TFL sentence, we only need to know the truth value of the constituent parts. And then that will determine each layer on up until we hit the main logical operator. So this is the notion that our language is based around. The whole language is structured on the 5 connectives. The 5 connectives are truth functional. In fact, there's something even cooler. It's not just that all the connectives are truth functional. That's all they are. They're just specific kinds of truth functions. Every connective in TFL does nothing more than simply map us between truth values. They aren't really meaningful in any way. All they are is just truth functions. They take in certain collections of truth values and spit out a truth value, either a T or an F, a 1 or a 0. This is why when we're symbolizing in TFL, we ignore everything except the contribution to the truth value. We don't care about things like meaning. We don't care about any of the nuances of natural language, like implicature or tone. We only care about, hey, does this bit indicate it probably should be on, or does this indicate it should be off, or does it impact the flow? And this is fine, because all we're interested in, again, with this tool, is just evaluating the truth functionality. I think I joked before about how we're building a sledgehammer. The sledgehammer is only interested in, is it breakable or not? Right? Doesn't care about any of the nuances. What color's the wall? Who gives a shit? Can we hit it with the hammer enough to break it? Right? That's what we're after here. We're setting aside a bunch of features of language because they are irrelevant to present purposes. So here's an example. In English, I can say something like, Brittany had a baby and got married. And in English, this sentence has an implication of order. That is, it was Brittany had a baby and then she got married. Right? Contrast it with the other way around. Brittany got married and had a baby. Right? This is purportedly conveying something that's slightly scandalous. Right? But if we say it the other way, it's, oh yeah, that's just the sort of thing lots of people do. But if we actually symbolize this into TFL, right, we could have B be Brittany had a baby, M be Brittany got married, and we would put it as B conjunction M. But there's no implication of order here. B conjunction M is the exact same as M conjunction B. Order and things like this drop away when we're thinking about TFL, because the order doesn't impact the truth functionality. And this is why I've banged on about this point, that we're not doing translation when we're going from things like English into TFL. We're not translating, because a good translation should keep things like this implication. It retains this sort of bits. It cares about all the nuance that we have in a natural language. TFL doesn't do that, so it's not a good translation. Really, it's just a sort of truth functional mapping. So the symbolization keys aren't telling us how to do a translation. They're merely telling us that the TFL atomic sentences should take the same truth values as these specific English sentences and vice versa. So again, this is highlighting a limitation of the language, but also why the language is so good at what it does. Okay, so that's the kind of underlying notion of truth functionality. And again, emphasizing the limitation on the language. The limitation is both a restriction, but also a strength. It only does one thing, but it's very good at it, which is great. So we can say this. When we treat a TFL sentence as symbolizing an English sentence, we're stipulating that the TFL sentence is to take the same truth value as the English one. That's all we're caring about when we're entering into TFL. What are the truth values? Not the meaning, not the reference, just what are the truth values? Okay, let's trundle on. So, We know that any non-atomic sentence of TFL is composed of atomic sentences linked by the sentential connectives. That's the core of the grammar. In TFL, the truth value of a complex sentence is going to be entirely determined by the truth values of the atoms that make it up. And exactly how this determination goes depends on the connections used. So what we need to do next is think about how each connective works. And this is where we get what we'll call characteristic truth tables. So each connective has a very specific kind of flow control. And the way we symbolize this is by using a table. So here's our characteristic tables. We're going to go through each one of the connectives. I'm going to tell you about the characteristic table for every single one. Okay? The first one's easy. Back up. Should say something about what tables are actually going to look like. Right? So a truth table is, as the name suggests, a literal table of truth values. Right? So we're going to have a column or a row at the top. Rows are the things that go across. Columns are the ones that go up and down. Right? We're going to have a row at the top that will have our sentences, our atoms that we're interested in, and then the complex sentence we're evaluating. And we're going to abbreviate the truth values as capital T's and capital F's. You could use ones and zeros if you want. You could use dots and dashes. I don't mind, as long as it's very clear which one is T and which one is F. Notably, the T's and the F's that we're using here are not expressions of TFL. They're ways for us to talk about the truth values. They're not TFL sentences. They're expressions in our meta language of augmented English. So it's a little bit easier to sort of see an example of this. And the core is going to be the rows. Right? The rows, again, rows go across, columns go up and down. Each row is going to be what we term a valuation. An evaluation is an assignment of truth values to particular atomic sentences. So we're going to say, okay, let's have A be true, B be false, and C be true. There's one valuation. Similarly, we could just say, let them all be false. Valuations are what our whole table is going to be built of. Each row is one valuation, right? A possible valuation in our space. The entire table, when we look up all of the valuations together, give us all the possible assignments of truth values. Effectively, if we look at the columns and the rows together, it's going to give us an assessment of the entire possibility space. At least it sounded metal, so it probably didn't break. So again, this point's really important. Each row going across represents an assignment of truth values. So it's basically one possible situation. And then if we construct our table in the right way, we can talk about every possible situation, or at least every relevant possible situation. Now, the really cool part is this last bit. If we build the tables right, not only do they show us every possible situation, every possible way we might assign truth values, but they'll let us calculate the truth value of the complex sentence. So that's really the core. Everything that we're going to talk about in the next hour, give or take, is going to be derived from this idea. This is the notion that every semantic property we're going to talk about is defined in terms of. And it's very important we get a grip on that, right? So whatever we're going to talk about next is always going to be characterized in terms of valuations. That is, assignments of truth values to relevant atoms. We're going to say, these atoms are true, these atoms are false, and that's going to tell us everything else. Okay. So here's our first characteristic truth table. What we can do, we can list the relevant sentences. So here's, in this case, we only need one because negation just takes a single sentence. And over here, we can list the complex sentence we're looking at. Right? So negation works by basically flipping truth value. We have all of the possible valuation combinations over here. A could be true or A could be false. We don't really care if A is atomic or as complex as you like. There's only two possibilities. It's on or it's off. And a negation works by flipping. If we feed in a true, it spits out a false. If we feed in a false, it spits out a true. Again, we don't care how complex that sentence is. If you slap a negation on front of it, it's going to flip the truth value. Now, of course, negation, super straightforward, very simple. It only has one input sentence. So what happens when we have two? Well, when we have two input sentences, this part's going to be a little more complex. We need to think about every possible combination of truth values for the two input sentences. So take A conjunction B. A conjunction B has A and B. So we need to think about how we could assign truth values to those. And of course, there's going to be four options. Both true, both false, one true and one false, the other true and the other false. So we just build that into our table. So over here, we have our columns of assigning the truth values to the atoms. And if we look at each row going across, each valuation, well, we take them all. That tells us all the possible ways that we could assign truth value to the inputs. And then we just list the column underneath the relevant connective, right? So conjunction works very simply. Conjunction is only happy if both sides are true. Right? So if A and B are both true, then the conjunction is true. Any other combination, conjunction is false. So I'll say that again because it's very important. Conjunction is only happy if both inputs are true. Any other way, the conjunction is false. Notably, and I mentioned this I think in some of the tutorials, this also indicates that conjunction is symmetric. That is, the order doesn't matter. A conjunction B and B conjunction A are the same sentence from TFL's perspective. Okay. So before we go on to the next one, pause, ask, do we get the kind of basic process here? Right? We list the combinations, and then we go through how each one of these connectives work. Is that kind of general idea clear? Yes?
Is there a reason why for the B column it's so true, false, true, false?
Good. So it doesn't really matter which option we kind of put. I'm going to teach you a method to kind of fill in the truth values here. All that matters is that when we look at these two together, we cover all the possible combinations. Right? So what we need is just make sure we cover the ones where they're both true, where it's like this, where it's like this, or where it's like this. Right? And this is a handy way to write it out. You could write it a different way, but this is an easy way to list them down. Okay, other questions on this before we move forward? So again, to go back a slide, negation takes the sentence it's given and then flips the truth value. So true becomes false, false becomes true. Conjunction is only true if both conjuncts are true. Any other circumstance, it's false. Okay. Now, our third connective is or. The disjunction. And the disjunction, to put it very simply, is easy to please. A disjunction is true if even one of the disjuncts is true. So if they're both true, disjunction's true. If the left one's true and the right one's false, cool, disjunction's still true. If we reverse it, disjunction's true. The only time a disjunction is false is if both are false. So the only time I can't give you coffee or tea is if I have neither coffee nor tea. Right? The only time I can't give you coffee or tea is if I don't have either. Right? If both of them let me down. Okay. So notably, again, the flip between conjunction and disjunction. Disjunction, easy to please, only false when both are false. Conjunction, to go back a slide, hard to please, only true when both are true. Okay? So, negation, conjunction, disjunction. I'm going to go slightly out of order and give you the biconditional before the conditional. The biconditional, and again, we have A and B. We have A biconditional B. It's going to be true if and only if the two sides have the same truth value. So the biconditional is true if A and B are both true. It's also true if A and B are both false. The only time a biconditional fails is if the sides have different truth values. So again, the thing with the biconditional, it's going to be true if the sides have the same truth value. That could be that they're both true. It could be that they're both false. But we don't care. The only time it lets us down is if the two sides have different truth values. Now, before we talk about the conditional, again, to stress, with all of these, we don't care about the nature of the sentences we're plugging in. They could be as simple or as complex as you like. These could be atoms, or they could be incredibly complex TFL sentences. Doesn't matter for the purposes of how these operators work. The function is always the same. The truth function is always the same. Doesn't matter how complex or simple the inputs are. All that matters is what truth value do the inputs have? Well, this is going to be the output. Okay, so cool. 4 out of 5. All that's left is the conditional. The conditional sucks. It's a mess. It's very weird. I'm going to tell you now. So let's go through the conditional one line by line. The conditional, first, if we have the antecedent and consequent both true, the conditional is true. If we have the antecedent true and the consequent false, the conditional is false. Now is where we start to get things a little bit weird. If we have the antecedent false and the consequent true, the conditional is true. And finally, if both are false, the conditional is true. Okay. So we have this function. If both are true, conditional is true. If antecedent true and consequent false, conditional false. If antecedent false and consequent true, conditional is true. And if both are false, conditional is true. This is weird. No lie, this is weird. So, one way we can kind of draw out why it's weird is let's think about it. Right? So here's one point of weirdness. Whenever the antecedent's false, the conditional turns out true. So here's a true conditional. If there are exactly 50 people in this room, then there are exactly 5,000 people in this room. That conditional is truth functionally true. It's because there's more than exactly 50 people. The antecedent's false. That's weird, right? Does everyone see how that's weird? This intuitively should not be a true conditional, and yet it is. So, whenever the antecedent's false, a conditional just turns out to be true. That's one thing that's weird. The other thing that's weird is that if the consequent is true, regardless of what the antecedent says, the conditional is true. Right? So, Here's another true conditional. If Nathan is a professional footballer, then Tilburg is in the Netherlands. This is a truth functionally true conditional. Obviously, I am not a professional footballer, right? But Tilburg is in fact in the Netherlands, so this conditional is true. This highlights something weird about our little arrow. Our arrow doesn't say anything about there being a connection between the antecedent and the consequent. At least not in terms of like relevance or meaning or anything like that. It's only interested in truth functional connections. Which is weird. Weird. Right? So these are actually what we call the paradoxes of material implication. The paradoxes of the conditional, as it were. They're paradoxical not in the sense that they entail a contradiction, but in that they violate pretty badly some basic intuitions we might have about if-then statements. And I think a fairly natural response to those is to be like, cool, if this is the best we can, if this is what we get, why do we use this treatment of if-then? Right? Why not do something else? And put really bluntly, the answer is this is the best we're going to get. You can think about the other possible combinations, the two placed conditionals we might define up. And noticeably, this one actually does the best. Yeah.
Couldn't you say that a third code doesn't have a truth value?
You could say a conditional doesn't have a truth value, right? If you wanted to. But of course, then we're back to the assumption we started with about gaps and gluts, right? So then you'd have to accept that there's a bunch of sentences that intuitively we think have truth values, but just don't.
Yeah, sure. Go with the definition.
Yeah. So that's kind of the thought here. But I want to take a minute and talk about it, right? So again, and this is useful because it highlights what we're after, why we're doing this, why we're developing the tool. The core idea behind building TFL is a formal language. We want a formal language consisting of atomic sentences, truth functional connectives, to make it clear when arguments are valid in virtue of form. This is what the tool is supposed to help us do. And we, again, say a connective is truth functional if the truth values of the constituent parts determine the truth value of the whole. If we're going to work with these restrictions, which is what we've set up TFL to do, then that's the best treatment that we're going to get to capture if-then. We just can't do any better. That's kind of a crappy explanation, but it is probably the most honest. Now, there is another motivation for thinking about the conditional in this way. And I've talked about this a little bit in some of the tutorials. We can motivate it by thinking about promises. So here's a promise. This is from Kai von Fentel. Right? We make a promise. If I'm healthy, then I will come to class. And you ask, right, when is this statement false? That is, when is the promise broken? Right? And we have 4 cases. I'm healthy and I come to class. I'm healthy, I blow it off, I stay home and I play FIFA. Right? I'm sick, but I show up anyway because I'm a hero. Right? Or I'm sick and I do the smart thing and stay home. Right? Now, if we think through these cases, we can ask, when is the promise broken? Right? In the first case, it's pretty clear that the promise is kept. Right? If you're healthy and you show up to class, cool, you did not break your promise. Right? Take the second case, you're healthy, but you stay home. Well, that looks like a paradigmatic case of breaking the promise, right? Because the promise was, if healthy, then at class. So that looks like a promise broken. The interesting one comes in 3 and 4. If we think about case 3, you're sick, but you show up to class anyway. You don't break your promise, right? You don't break your promise. So there's a sense in which the promise is still upheld. And the same thing with the last one. If you're sick and you stay home, then again, doesn't seem like you break your promise. Because the promise was, if you're healthy, then you'll be at class. You're not healthy, so it's okay, it's permissible to not attend. So you get a table that looks a little bit like this. And does this look like anything we've seen already? Yeah, it's the same fucking table. So if you don't like the "this is the best we're going to get" argument, which to be honest, a lot of people don't, there's an alternative kind of motivation here. If you read a conditional as something like this truth functional promise, whenever antecedent is true, consequent will be true as well, which is a plausible way to read the conditional, then we have good motivation for actually using this truth table. So, the long and the short of it is when we think about the material conditional, when we use the arrow, here is its characteristic table. The important thing to note is the only time it is false, the only time the conditional is false, is when the antecedent's true and the consequence false. Every other time, conditional claim is true. Cool? Again, weird, but hopefully we get it. Okay? So, what did we do so far, right? I've told you the characteristic tables for all the connectives. Yes?
I'm just wondering, like, the example that you gave about 50 people being in the lecture room, 5,000 people.
Yeah.
Are those both not mutually exclusive statements?
Good. So when we symbolize into TFL, that drops away, right?
But isn't it true to say that if one is to be true, then the other has to be false because it depends on what the other being false?
So importantly, that's because of the meaning of these sentences. It's not because of anything like their form, right? So remember an argument we talked about just a few in lecture 1, I think. I told you about the argument with premise 1, the Pope is a bachelor. Conclusion, therefore the Pope is male. Okay? That's valid. And it's valid because the meaning of the notion of being a bachelor entails being male. But if we write that in TFL, that's not a valid argument. Because the structure of these sentences doesn't give us validity. The same thing. So what's really weird, to go back to the Martian moons example from lecture 1, in TFL, that argument is not valid. And it's not valid because the sentences themselves aren't structurally jointly inconsistent. They're inconsistent because of what they mean. Right? So again,
How can you take the meaning in one sense and then only the form of the other?
good. So remember what the language is designed to do. Just to go back. This is all we're doing. We are only interested in truth functionality. We are only looking for, is an argument valid in virtue of its form? That's all this tool can do. So we don't care about meaning. We don't care about any of that. It drops away. We only think about truth functionality. When is this true? When is this false? That's it. That is absolutely it. This is, again, the limitation, but also the beautiful utility of the language. Right? We don't care about notions like meaning. Right? It's the sledgehammer. It doesn't really do nuance like meaning. Right? Yeah.
Would it be wrong to symbolize the sentence if there are exactly 15 people in this lecture room, then there are exactly 5,000 people in this lecture room as a conditional B and not A and B?
So strictly speaking, yes, because it's not part of the actual sentence, right? The structure of the atoms doesn't include this. When we understand what the English says, yes, right? But of course, if we're just looking at the form, right? The pure logical form of these sentences, it's not there. It's in the meaning of the sentences themselves.
Okay.
That's the important thing. I mean, this is again, the thing that we have to get kind of mindset into when we're doing TFL. Right? We don't care about the meaning of anything that we're mapping. We only want to preserve logical structure. And in this case, those sentences are effectively atomic. This is the limitation of the language. This is a limitation of the language. And actually, we'll talk about one very obviously valid argument that TFL renders invalid at the beginning of next lecture. So if you remember the very first argument from exercise A on page 6, Socrates is a man, all men are carrots, Socrates is a carrot. Clearly valid. In TFL, it is not valid because it's not true in virtue of the structure. So again, this is part of the difficulty here. But that's okay, because that's just what this tool is designed for. It's only designed to track this. Valid in virtue of form, logical form of sentences, nothing about their meaning. We're going to get to the next language. Hint, hint, that's what it does. But we got to get this first. Okay. We've got all of the characteristic tables. Again, the easiest way to think about these is basically input-output functions. Right? The tables tell us, here's what the values for the inputs are, and then it tells us what the output value must be. So the next step is going to be to use these basic characteristic tables to start doing complete truth tables. That is where we're going to take full-blown complex TFL sentences and generate tables for them. To do that, we're going to use these characteristic tables. Right? Again, it's easier if you see examples rather than just the general idea. So the last bit just on the conditional. We still have these lurking weird paradoxes. And one explanation for the paradoxes, the kind of, it's weird that things like exactly 50, then exactly 5,000, right, comes out true, is because there's something more than just pure truth functionality in play here. We're appealing to things like the meaning. We're appealing to maybe something like relevance between antecedent and consequent. That drops away in TFL. It is purely truth functional. Right? And there's another point to note here, and I'm going to go through this very quickly, is that English has more than just one kind of if-then claim. We can draw it out by comparing if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, then someone else did, with if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, someone else would have. Now, given one, right, taking one, we know it's true. Right? Because we know somebody did, in fact, shoot Kennedy. Right? So if Oswald didn't do it, well, then somebody else did. It's a historical fact that Kennedy was shot. Right? So one can be true. But two is sort of QAnon, weird, conspiracy theory. It says, okay, we're already assuming that Oswald did shoot Kennedy. But if he hadn't done that, then somebody else would have. The Cubans, the CIA, right? The mafia, whoever you want to plug in here. The difference here is this bottom one is what we call a subjunctive conditional. It's a counterfactual. The antecedent is always something that hasn't happened, and then you think about what would have happened were it to have been the case. So we grant Oswald shot Kennedy, and we said, okay, if he hadn't done that, then the dude on the grassy knoll would have gotten him. Say. It's just important to note the difference here. I think Michael's going to talk to you more about the difference between an indicative, which is this kind, and a subjunctive, which is this counterfactual kind. For our purposes, we can just glide over it. We're only ever going to deal with indicative conditionals. If you see an if-then, you can read it like the conditional. You don't need to read it as this counterfactual claim. Okay. So, before we take a break, ask real quick, how are people feeling about this basic idea with the truth tables? Does it make sense? Is it sort of okay? Okay, cool. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a little break. It's 31, so let's go till 40, so 9 minutes. Sounds good? to 1:30 or 1:40, and then we'll come back and we'll do the rest.